We're continuing on page 570 of the bilingual edition, which is in the middle of Siman Kuf Ayin 170 in the Simanim of Rav Chaim Friedlander. And we've been discussing the two hanhagas, the two ways that Hashem deals with the world. One way is through reward and punishment. When people do good things, they get rewarded. When they do bad things, they get punished. That's called hanhagas schar v'anish. But there's another way that Hashem deals with the world, called hanhagas hayichud or hanhagas hamazal, which means that independent of people's actions, Hashem is constantly pushing the world to its final conclusion, where the world recognizes that God is one and He's the only being with any power. He's the ultimate power. And we mentioned how sometimes when tzaddikim suffer, when the righteous suffer, that's because Hashem isn't operating the world with schar v'onish, with reward and punishment, but rather with hanhagas hamazal. We said in hanhagas hamazal, Hashem allows evil to grow, and He leaves it unchecked in a certain way, because He wants evil to grow so that at the end of days, when Hashem destroys that evil, the greater that evil is, when Hashem destroys it, will be a bigger Kiddush Hashem and a bigger revelation of Hashem's oneness and of Hashem's power. So during that time when Hashem allows evil to grow, the righteous naturally will suffer. Now we said that doesn't mean that the righteous are suffering for no reason. We said that the righteous will be rewarded for the good deeds that they did in Olam Haba, in the next world, and for the suffering that they endured. So let's continue. In the Midrash of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Nimtza Maimer Echad, we find a statement, so even though it is very deep with many secrets, he says, if you don't know the introductions which we just discussed, this medrash would appear very strange. This is what it said. It says at the time when Hashem removes Himself from the throne of judgment and from the throne of mercy, there's no reward and no punishment. It appears that He's saying there's no reward and punishment. God forbid. But rather the medrash is saying what we were just talking about. It doesn't mean to say that there's no reward and punishment. It means that there are certain times when Hashem doesn't run the world through His hanhaga of reward and punishment. Ela b'hanhagas hamazal. Rather through His hanhaga of mazal, the hanhaga where He's directing the world to its final conclusion. Like we explained, that the good and the evil come in order to bring the world to its final rectification. But for sure there's going to be reward and punishment in the next world, meaning after Hashem reveals Himself, after Mashiach, after Tchias HaMeisim, when we have Olam Haba, that's at the point where there's going to be the ultimate reward and punishment. That's when a person will reap what he sowed. But this medrash tells us the time right before Mashiach comes, before the Messiah comes, we shouldn't be disheartened if we see that before Mashiach comes, the righteous are very lowly and they're being oppressed. The righteous, very bad things are happening to the righteous before Mashiach comes. And if people cry out to Hashem and they're not answered, and all the other bad things that the sages say will happen before Mashiach comes. At the end of Sota, it says bad things will happen before Mashiach comes, like Be'ikvus Mashiach, chutzpah, there'll be a lot of chutzpah in the world, a lot of audacity, insolence. It says the wisdom of scholars will be scorned, the people who fear sin will be despised, truth will disappear, if anyone sees any of that going on now. All these bad things will happen before Mashiach comes. Why? The reason is because the righteous people, even with the merits that they have, aren't able to rectify the deficiencies in the world. Because the time period in the history of the world at that point, that's what's causing it. Meaning that at that point in history, right before Mashiach comes, there's going to be a lot of evil in the world. The reason is because the greater the evil is, then the greater revelation of Hashem there is when Hashem destroys that evil. So at that point, right before Mashiach, there's going to be a lot of bad things happening, a lot of chutzpah, people who follow Hashem and do the right thing will be despised, they'll be mocked. But when Mashiach comes, all of that evil will be destroyed. So people shouldn't be disheartened if they daven to Hashem and they're not answered, or they see righteous people suffering, because in the days before Mashiach, it's been said that bad things will happen and evil will have power. He says, now, another topic. You have to know another introduction. To answer many questions. Even when Hashem is operating the world through Hanagas HaMazel, he says that even when Hashem is operating through Hanagas HaMazel, the way, again, that's the Hanhaga that brings the world to its final rectification. Even when he's doing that, he operates it with the Hanhaga of Schar Va'onish. He's going to explain what that means. We find this with the suffering of Rebbe. Sha'amr Zal, the rabbi said, his Rebbe suffered, and it was through something that he did that it came, and it's something that he did that he left. Now, he's going to explain. The suffering that Rebbe incurred was the suffering of the righteous, of a kachi hamida. But this is the mida. Hashem mixed these two hanhagas together. But the hanhagas hamazel that had to happen, Hashem mixed it with schar va'onish. So it's like this. Rebbe Yehuda suffered a lot. Now the real cause of why he suffered was because there was something. Rebbe was the leader of the generation, and he was an extremely righteous person, but he had to suffer. He had to suffer because that was going in some way to help the rectification of the world. Right? It's called Yisuri Tzadikim. The leaders of the generation, the Ramchal talks about this also in Derech Hashem, the leaders of the generation can suffer for their generation and cause certain rectifications. So it wasn't because of his sins that he was suffering, but because the world needed it. And he was the leader and the most righteous person in the world. However, the Ramchal says that nevertheless, his suffering was attached to a small sin that he did. What was it probably wasn't even a sin. I don't think it was even a sin. The incident was that there was a calf being taken to slaughter, and the calf went under Rebbe's cloak, went under his coat to be shielded from slaughter. And Rebbe said to him, "You were created to be slaughtered, and go." And on some level, that was an insensitivity to the animal that Rebbe exhibited. And so because of that insensitivity, he suffered. He had tremendous physical suffering. Now, the reason that he was suffering wasn't because of that sin, meaning that wasn't something, let's say he showed a little insensitivity to animals. He didn't deserve, because of that sin, to suffer the way he did. He was suffering the way he did because it was needed for the rectification of the world. However, it was connected to the sin, the insensitivity that he had to this animal. There's another famous example of this. So again, we're saying that even though there are two separate ways that Hashem runs the world, they're interconnected in the sense that if something has to happen for the rectification of the world through suffering or something like that, Hashem connects it to a sin or to something negative that a person or a people did. Another example is like this. It was necessary for the world, for human history, that the Jewish people go down and be slaves in Egypt, because through that they would get the Torah and become the Am HaNivchar, become the chosen people. That was something that was necessary. So their suffering wasn't because of sins that they did. It was because the suffering in Egypt was because it was necessary for the rectification of the world. However, nevertheless, it was attached to a sin, because Abraham said, Abraham, our forefather, didn't have total trust in Hashem, and he asked Hashem, how do I know that my children will inherit the land? And because of that small the small doubt he had in his faith, the Jewish people were punished to go down to be slaves in Egypt. But again, the reason they were slaves wasn't because of the sin. They didn't deserve to be slaves because of what Abraham did. Rather, they had to be slaves because it was necessary for the rectification of the world. Hashem just attached it to this small sin, what Abraham did in his small lack of bitachon, of trust in Hashem. Okay. Shaharei agabav. We didn't finish the line. Yisgalgo kol atzarich yisgalgo afal pi shebe'atzmo lo yeh el davar katan. So even though these actions, what Rebbe did with the calf, it was a very minor thing, a small, insensitive action that he did, and what Abraham did was a small lack of faith. But nevertheless, since suffering was required for the rectification of the world, Hashem attached those things to those small sins. Continues the Ramchal. Klal shel davar. The general summary is like this: Shorish an haga b'emes hu inyan hatikun hakoli shekol animtzoyes. Hasolev hakatvi tchunas animtzoyim atman. L'fi masha asom habari yizbarach shemo v'chol gegulei han haga hazos emel sivuvi dvarim ha'olchem al tachlis hatikun hakoli hazos shezacharnu b'hasim mehem kol ha'chazoros ha'mitzvim behem. The whole han haga of the way Hashem directs the world to its final perfection on these axes is in order to fix all deficiencies in the world, to remove all the deficiencies in the world. And the way that Hashem does this is very deep. We don't know the details. We only know the general rules. We don't know the details of how Hashem does this. Now, while this is happening, simultaneously, while this is happening, that Hashem is directing the world to its final conclusion, there's another thing Hashem is doing at the same time, called schar v'onish, reward and punishment. This is a revealed way that Hashem deals with the world. Everything in the heaven and the earth is dependent on it. But everything is ultimately connected to this rectification of the world that we mentioned. Right, these two hanhagos of reward and punishment and directing the world to its final conclusion, they're not opposites, they're not operating against each other, but they work together. On the contrary, the main hanhaga here, the main way Hashem deals with the world is directing it to its final purpose. But Hashem knows in His great wisdom, Hashem knows simultaneously, while He's directing the world to its final conclusion, He knows how to deliver reward and punishment during that time, and not detract from the fact, actually help the world reach its final conclusion. So rather, the hanhaga of reward and punishment is attached to this hanhaga of the ultimate of the redemption. And whatever is required by the system of perfection, the last thing we mentioned, that whatever is required through the tikkun, the rectification of the world, Hashem attaches it to, He channels it through reward and punishment, like we said with the example of Rebbe and the example of the Jews in Egypt. Efes ki helema halden baruchu minivrav hasagos hanhaga elyon azos. He says that Hashem concealed all of these workings from us. Right? The hanhaga itself, how we know in general that Hashem is directing the world to its final conclusion. How is Hashem doing that specifically right now? That He hid from us. Not only that, He hid from us the way that the ultimate rectification is related to reward and punishment. Even prophets, those who spoke to Hashem directly, did not understand. They saw what they saw. They didn't get to the depth of the matter. The prophets would see certain things, but they were confused. They were in doubt as to what they meant. Like the rabbi said in the pasuk, I will show favor to whomever I wish, and I will have mercy on whomever I wish. And like we mentioned earlier, we said that you see someone you see a righteous person who's suffering. We don't know. We can't know why certain righteous people suffer and certain righteous people don't suffer. We know the general rules, right? We know that a righteous person who is suffering, that might be because he has to suffer like Rebbe did for the rectification of the world. Now, why does Tzaddik A suffer and Tzaddik B not suffer? That we have no idea. We can't know. We don't know the depth of why Hashem is doing things specifically. But knowing these things in general answers many questions that people have about why bad things happen to good people. Wish everyone a great day.